especially around the busy holiday season. You'll note that our host, Kwabena, has just turned on the recording. So hopefully if people miss the session because of these technology challenges, they'll be able to watch the recording in the future. So I want to welcome you to Social Impact's Evidence for Impact webinar series. This is one of many webinars that we've done, and this one is specifically on strengthening your team's CLA practice. And we're going to be talking specifically about a tool to help you do that, which is the CLA Maturity Tool for USAID implementing partners. The Evidence for Impact webinar series, if you're not familiar with it, is a chance to really shine a light on different tools, approaches, and innovations and ways that we can use evidence to actually promote stronger outcomes in our programs. And so when we were thinking about the CLA Maturity Tool, there are a couple of tie-ins to that idea of evidence for impact. And the first is that the development of the tool itself, the original that you're going to hear about, as well as this version for USAID implementing partners, has been a very evidence-driven process. And so you're going to hear both from my colleagues, Mona Lisa and Lauren Lee Hinthorn, about that in just a minute. But then the other thing is that the tool itself can help you, if you use it, generate evidence for how you want to move forward in your CLA practice. So it is based on evidence, but it also can help you generate your own evidence. And so that's why we thought it would be a nice fit for this webinar series. I will make sure to share the link at the end to the other webinars that we've had in the past if you're interested in watching any of the other recordings. But just wanted to explain a little bit about how this fits into the broader series. And we're excited to be sharing it with you this morning. Let me get my facilitation plan up. So want to just do quick introductions. You'll meet more people as we go. But as I said, I'm going to be co-hosting with my colleague, Mona Lisa Salib. She's the Deputy Chief of Party from USAID Learns. She's based in Vietnam, so it's evening for her there, and we're grateful she was able to join us. She and I are both members of Social Impact's LAMP group, which stands for Learning, Adaptive Management, and Participation. And this is sort of like Social Impact's community of practice on CLA. And so we're excited to be representing LAMP with you guys here today. We also have Lauren Lee Hinthorn, who I mentioned. She is on USAID's CLA team, and she has been one of the pioneers of the CLA Maturity Tool for years and years. So she's going to talk to us a bit about the history of the tool. And Mona Lisa and I have been working with her on that for, gosh, it feels like forever now. And then we have Ryan Bean from Winrock International. He works on the Reducing Pollution project in Vietnam, and he was one of our pioneers. He and his project were one of our pioneers to use this version of the tool just this past year. So he's going to be sharing his experience with us. And then we also have another colleague from Vietnam, from the EPIC program, Van Eng, but we're having trouble getting her into the room. So my fingers crossed that we're able to get Van Eng to join us before the end of the meeting. So her and her project EPIC were another of our pioneers in using this version of the tool. So we have two opportunities to hear, hopefully, testimonials from them. Okay, let's dive right in. We have a poll that we're going to do, and we're going to use Zoom's annotate feature. And I want to just give you a quick idea of how to use that. The poll is on the next slide, but let me explain how this works. So at the top of your screen, you should see you're viewing Jess Ziegler's screen. And next to it, there's a drop down that says View Options. And if you click on the drop down, you're going to see a link called Annotate. And when you click on it, it's going to open a bar that looks like the one I've got shown on the screen. And there's a stamp option, and there's a check mark. So View Options, Annotate, Stamp, check mark. And what we're going to do is on this slide, there's two questions. How familiar are you with the CLA framework? So you put your check mark above the grid, the scale. And then how familiar are you with the CLA Maturity Tool? And so you put your check mark below. Carla has given us a great example. So has Kristen. So people are finding it. So annotate and then the check mark, which is a stamp. And go ahead and tell us your level of familiarity, both with the framework above the grid and the maturity tool below. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat on how to use the function or come off mute and I can talk you through it again. But it seems like people are figuring it out. Okay, so we've got a lot of people in the green. I'm familiar with it. Some people in the I've used it, but plenty of people on the lower side too, which is totally fine. We also wanted to give you guys a chance to practice this functionality because we're going to use it again when we come to actually playing around with the tool itself. So this is our kind of like our test on can we use the annotate feature. Okay, a good range of people. That's terrific. Kind of what we expected to see. So for those of you who feel like you're on the lower end, fear not. Lauren and Mona Lisa are going to give you all the basics, and then we're going to get a chance to play with the tool. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off annotate for the moment. We'll turn it back on when we use it again. And I'm going to clear all our check marks. And I, at this point, just want to quickly walk us through the agenda and the objectives, and then we'll dive right in. So we're going to be introducing the maturity tool, and then we will be hearing from Brian from the use case of when Winrock was able to use the maturity tool this past year on their reducing pollution activity. We're going to play with the tool itself. So we're going to do a demo in plenary all together, and then we're going to have an experience in breakout rooms. Where we can have a smaller, more intimate conversation about the tool. And then hopefully by then, Vaneng will be on and we'll be able to hear about FHI's experience using it. And we'll save plenty of time at the end for Q&A and resources so that you know where to find all this stuff because it's all publicly available. And we want to make sure that you have those links and that you can dive right into using the tool yourself. And so hopefully you see that that aligns to what we're hoping to achieve with you today, making sure that we're introducing the tool, highlighting its uses, and giving you an experience with it. So with that, I am going to turn over to Lauren to tell us a bit about sort of the background of the tool. Lauren, over to you.
Thanks, Jess. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Lee Hinthorn. I sit on the CLA team in USAID, but I'm currently an independent consultant working with the agency through Highlight, that mechanism. And I was just realizing, I think it was just yesterday, Jess and Mona Lisa, it's been 8 years since all this work happened, which is kind of crazy. But it's really great. And I think it's not an overstatement to say that working on this tool over those past years has really been one of the highlights of my career, in part because when we started out, we had no idea what it would become. And so it's fantastic that all this time later, it's still evolving and people are using it and finding kind of new ways to help, new ways to use this tool that helps them identify how CLA can help improve development outcomes. So a little bit about the tool for those of you who may not have used it before or might not be so experienced with it. Basically, the idea behind the CLA Maturity Tool is that it articulates examples of what CLA can look like at different kind of levels of practice. So ranging from we're not really doing this part of CLA very much yet through to this is how we live, eat, breathe, sleep our work. And so the idea in giving those examples was just to help make more concrete some of the abstract principles and practices that make up CLA. The other thing that the tool is supposed to do is help us think more deliberately about how we can tailor CLA to our own contexts, organizations, challenges, development objectives. So it's highly customizable. And the tool can be used both to self-assess your current practice, so to kind of do a bit of a pulse check on how are we currently using CLA, but it can also be used as a planning tool for identifying areas of improvement or particular CLA practices that might really help you achieve your development outcomes. And then it can be used, to identify those areas of growth and plan for those in an intentional way. Next slide. So, brief history of the tool. It didn't just start out as it is. In fact, it looked very, very different back in 2015 when Mona Lisa and I first started working on it. Our initial concept was to develop a maturity matrix, which is a thing out in the world you may have identified or may have used maturity matrices for other types of concepts. There was a World Bank, I think, KM maturity matrix that we looked at quite a lot originally. So it's basically just a table or a spreadsheet that has, again, those stages of practice for different concepts or principles. And very quickly, our spreadsheet got out of control. As we were trying to unpack what were the different elements of CLA, I think fairly early on, we started talking about the enabling conditions, but the number of components kind of accordioned out, up and down, in and out, as we were trying to really articulate what is that core set of principles and practices. And then at some point, my own background is in participatory research methodology. And at some point, I don't even remember how it came up to me, but I was like, what if we turn each of those cells in the spreadsheet into independent cards so that we could kind of manipulate them and kind of zoom in and out of the matrix in a different sort of way that wasn't so dependent on the screen. And so that kind of took us through a whole process. I won't get into all of the steps now, but a whole process of kind of developing the tool over the course of maybe a year to 18 months, which included a lot of field testing with USAID missions, testing with partners in Washington, and continuing to refine both the tool, but also the concepts. So you can see on this poster a little bit about what that evolution looked like. And ultimately, we kind of landed, I think, middle of 2016-ish on version 7, which is the sort of published version of the original CLA Maturity Tool. Next slide. The other thing I wanted to point out in terms of process development that you kind of saw a little bit of on the previous screen was that the framework and the maturity tool actually kind of were developed and evolved in tandem with each other. So it started out with this maturity matrix idea, but as we were trying to articulate the different concepts and the different stages of practice, we kind of ended up simultaneously really articulating and developing that framework. So what started as a spreadsheet actually evolved into two resources: the CLA framework wheel or pie on the left of the screen that shows the components and subcomponents of CLA, and then the maturity cards, which are on the right-hand side of your screen, that articulate each of those subcomponents at different levels of practice. And I think that's all I was going to say in terms of history. Mona Lisa, anything you would add, or Jess?
No, that's great. It's just taking me back a few years.
All right, thanks, Lauren. Mona Lisa, I think let's turn it over to you to dive a bit into sort of that's the history, and then what brought us to the point where we decided that we needed an IP version of this.
Yeah, great. So yeah, I feel like also we should note, by the way, that when we made this originally with USAID, that was under the USAID Learn contract when we were with Dex's Consulting Group, and now Jess and I are with Social Impact, and we were running a leadership development track for USAID implementing partners in Vietnam. And I just said in a meeting, hey, why don't we make an implementing partner version of the CLA Maturity Tool so that they can use that in the track? So that's how it started. And it really, after I said that, I was sort of like, I can't believe we never made one before. It wasn't that hard to do. So it's just funny that it's sort of taken a number of years to get there. But so we reached out to USAID, Lauren and Rena, who's on the CLA team as well at USAID, and said, hey, we're thinking to do this. Is that all right? Because obviously this whole tool belongs to USAID. So they were really supportive, which was great. And so we dived into making a partners version. So when we made that partners version, we really wanted to stick as closely as we could to the original for USAID. And so the original tool was, as Lauren mentioned, for USAID missions. USAID Washington bureaus and offices, operating units used it as well, but the wording on the cards was very much tailored to USAID missions. So the next thing we had to do was obviously remove any USAID specific language. So things like mission, Foreign Service National, FSN, other things that are just very USAID specific. So we removed all of that and made it more neutral for partners. And then we also, there were some lingering things from that version 7 that was published several years ago that, I had always had in my mind, oh, if we ever did a version 8, I would want to update some of these things. And so you'll see some of those in the updates that we made for the IP version. And then, of course, in our context, we also had the tool translated into Vietnamese because we were targeting, at that point, USAID Vietnam implementing partners and wanted to have the tool in both English and Vietnamese for stakeholders here in Vietnam. So we can go to the next slide. So I'll just highlight some of those key differences. So the first is under the learning component, we kept, of course, the theory of change subcomponent, but we updated some of the language to align with some of the thinking that we had actually done jointly with USAID here in Vietnam around what a quality theory of change really looks like. And for those of, maybe some of you were at the last webinar last month where we introduced the theory of change workbook, but a lot of the changes, relatively minor to this subcomponent, were related to updating what does it really mean to have a quality theory of change that aligns with that workbook. The next key difference, and this is maybe a larger one and one of the ones that I think lingered for all of us a little bit from the version 7 that was for USAID missions. So under the learning component, we had a subcomponent called scenario planning. And what we did was we changed that to be broader, to be about contextual awareness. And actually after that change, we did get some emails from USAID colleagues saying, oh, maybe we should think about that change for the USAID one. Basically what we wanted to do was just make it broader than scenario planning. Scenario planning is one tool in the toolbox when you're thinking about the local context. So that subcomponent just became broader, and scenario planning is mentioned, but it's broader and looking at, are you aware of what's happening in the local context, monitoring shifts in context, and those sorts of things. So just a bit broader. The next key difference is M&E for learning, also relatively minor in the grand scheme of things. The subcomponent originally was called also M&E for learning, but in USAID world, evaluation is really reserved for USAID to do. And so we changed the language on this one to focus more on research and internal evaluation. So that's really just to align with USAID policy, where evaluation should be carried out independently, often through third-party mechanisms like our contract in Vietnam. And so we just wanted to make the language a little bit more relevant to IPs, to implementing partners, who also do a lot of ongoing research to understand the context and to decide, how to program. And then another key difference was around institutional memory. So this subcomponent originally included a key concept related to what the people who are called Foreign Service Nationals. Those are the staff who are from the country that USAID is working in. And so we removed that concept, obviously, because at implementing partners, we don't call local staff Foreign Service Nationals. And we also focused on making the difference explicit between what's known as explicit knowledge, which is the knowledge that is written down, that you have access to, you can grab and find in your SharePoints or your Google Drive, and tacit knowledge, which was never mentioned in the original, which is probably equally, if not more important, which is the knowledge that's retained in everybody's head and is hard to transfer between people. We also added a focus on onboarding, seeing that that was really important to how people are brought into the organization, what they learn about the organization, how they know how to function in their team and organization. So we made that a part of institutional memory as well. And then this is probably the biggest change out of everything. Originally in the USA, the tool for USAID missions, resources was about CLA and implementing mechanisms, and then mission resources. And obviously we had to completely change that because we had, this is just for implementing partners. So the way we broke it down was between people, the people resources, the human resources, and then another category of other resources. Unfortunately, we couldn't come up with another name for other resources, so maybe uncreatively called other resources, but captures everything that's not related to the people. So we have in the people subcomponent now, we have a focus on roles and responsibilities vis-a-vis collaborating, learning, and adapting, whether the team is building their capacity in CLA, and whether the team is looking for CLA skills when they're hiring and when they're doing performance reviews. And then in other resources, we look at, is there time and budget for CLA? Is there resource flexibility, and MEL and knowledge management systems, very importantly. So just a quick telling you what comes with the tool. So first of all, we have, as you saw from, I think what Lauren was showing, each subcomponent has one key concept card, which always has 3 key concepts. That is what that subcomponent is about. And then it has the spectrum cards from not yet present to institutionalized that demonstrates what that level of CLA practice looks like at that level of maturity. Then you have stage cards. So when you do this in person, very often, actually almost always, we use these cards so that when you lay out the cards and you explain to people the spectrum of the maturity spectrum, you give people a moment to think, where do I see our organization or our team? And then they have these cards, they have all 5, and then they pick which one they think is most closely relates to where they see their team. And then we usually, 1, 2, 3, let's all put our cards down, and then you can see where everybody on the team sees themselves. And that's the starting point for conversation. It's not the most important thing. The most important thing is the conversation that happens after, and where people see themselves, why they see themselves there, where they can improve. It's really the conversation after that that's the most important. And you can see, I won't go into this in detail, but in the bullets here, you can see that for the levels of maturity, generally across the whole tool, there are standards that we stuck to. So not yet present is truly, we are not doing this yet. Emergent is often, we talk about it as only a few people, or rarely we're doing this. Expanding, we talk about either a minority of staff are doing this, or sometimes we do this. Advanced, we often talk about a majority of staff are doing this, or we as an organization or team usually do this. And then institutionalized is it's very consistent, systematic, and really across the board in the organization or team. And then lastly, online, for the maturity tool for implementing partners, we didn't create any new facilitation instructions because the process is exactly the same as the process for USAID missions. So there, when you get the links to the slides, there you'll find a link to the facilitation resources that were created for the original tool, but you can use the same facilitation resources with the implementing partner tool, just knowing that some of the words on the cards have been adjusted. So what is this? How do we use this tool? There's really 2 main things that we use this tool for. One is the self-assessment part, where a team or organization can use the tool, see the spectrum of maturity, and self-identify and say, oh, we see ourselves in expanding or emergent, and have a conversation around that what their practice looks like on their team for any of the 16 subcomponents. They can then also use that as the basis for action planning. We often tell people don't try and go from, emergent to institutionalized. It's all about what makes sense for the team and what's useful to them in order to be a more effective team. So it may just be small adjustments. At times with teams, we've talked about action planning where they are emergent and they just become a stronger emergent. So you don't have to think of it as I'm trying to, get to some much higher level. It's all about incremental improvements that are useful to the team so they can be more effective. So we start the self-assessment process with an intro and framing about the CLA framework and the tool. And then there's a subcomponent selection. So that's when the people using the tool can figure out which subcomponents do I really want to dive into. When we do the process, we usually don't obviously have time for all 16 subcomponents. So oftentimes, teams will sort of pick their top 4 or so that they really want to dive into. Then based on the subcomponent selection, and sometimes we also only choose the first subcomponent, and that because everything in the CLA framework is interconnected, that can lead you to talking about other subcomponents. So you don't even always have to know every single subcomponent when you start the process. So then they do the self-assessment, again, laying out the cards, having a conversation about where they see themselves along the spectrum of maturity. And they identify where they see themselves now. And then they also talk about, well, where do we want to be? And again, we don't promote, trying to go speedy to much higher levels, make it manageable, make it useful for the team. So then they end up at that point when the self-assessment part is done with where their current state and their aspirational state. Then as they move into action planning, they can brainstorm the actions that will help them bridge that gap between the current state and the aspirational state. So we do brainstorming, we do prioritization of those actions, and then you end up with a fuller action plan, typically with people responsible and timelines and that kind of thing. And I see, Lauren, your comment. Do you want to share it with the group?
Sure. I was just noting we did back in the day think that self-assessing across the whole framework was probably the way to go. And we tried it and very quickly realized that was a very, very bad idea. So when I talk about using the tool inside the agency and kind of with the stakeholders that I normally work with, we really encourage people to prioritize and be selective and choose maybe 2 to 4 subcomponents that are most relevant to your work. But it's really about, again, that customizable feature and focusing rather than feeling like you need to do it all.
Yeah, totally.
Okay. The other thing that we often encourage people to think about is when you're picking is also, if you remember when Mona Lisa was talking about the framework and having sort of a CLA side and enabling conditions side is also making sure people are looking across both sides of that. But it really is meant to be a choose your own adventure and what makes sense for you, where your project is at the moment. But never forgetting that really important CLA enabling conditions side. We actually, it's so important. We have a saying for those of you who are familiar with the CLA framework. So it's CLA, collaborating, learning, and adapting. And then on the blue side, it's culture, processes, and resources, CPR. And we say CPR, culture, processes, resources, keeps CLA alive. So just to stress the importance of both sides of the framework. All right. So thank you, Mona Lisa. Thank you, Lauren, for walking us through sort of what comes, like the history of it, what comes with the cards, how the process is meant to work. We're going to dive in just a minute to like actually playing with the cards ourselves in a virtual space. But before we do that, I do want to give Brian a chance to tell us a little bit about reducing pollution's use of the tool. So Brian, over to you. Please tell us.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks for the invitation. It's a nice chance to sort of actually reflect back on how we have used this tool. My name is Brian Bean. I'm the chief of party of a USAID program called Reducing Pollution in Vietnam. And we've been very fortunate to work with Social Impact and the LEARNS project on a number of different things related to improving implementation and outcomes in Vietnam. And so this was just kind of one great example of where we've really appreciated that support from Social Impact and Learns. So as Lauren and Mona Lisa mentioned this as well, the CLA Maturity Tool is kind of a chance to do both a pulse check or a kind of assessment of where you are, but then also plan and then how you as a team can move forward. And so what we did with the CLA Maturity Tool was kind of a combination of the two. The photograph you can see here was part of an event that we did internally for our team that was a combination of a pause and reflect, kind of looking back on our first year. We were finishing our first year of implementation and getting ready to start our second. So we were kind of looking back on how we had worked as a team in that first year, and we were kicking off our annual work plan process for the coming year. So we kind of were trying to do both of those, look back, but then also look forward in terms of what we were going to do, but importantly, how we wanted to work as a team. I really appreciated that Lauren just said that, you know, the recommendation is to start with 2 to 4 subcomponents. We were a little unsure of what to do, so we said, let's just start with 2. And so apparently we did the right thing. So we focused on internal communications and adaptive management. And again, those were kind of a part of our way of looking at how we were working as a team, but then how we wanted to remain flexible in the coming year to adapt and adjust to changing circumstances that we might not be able to predict, but see new opportunities coming. And so this picture you can see here, we did exactly what Mona Lisa described. We had our subcomponents, our topics, and then we did the same thing of 1, 2, 3. Everyone in that group put down where they felt as a team we were for that particular component, and that was our conversation starter. So one thing that the team really appreciated about this tool is that it was a great way to start that discussion within a group. And it was not, you know, sometimes when you have kind of a facilitator who asks a question, there can be a little bit of crickets in the room as everyone's trying to figure out what to say. And with this, everyone throws their card down, everyone has sort of, you know, given some initial thought, and that helps that conversation start very, very quickly. One thing that was a little bit, took a couple rounds of practicing, and we did 1 or 2 practice rounds before we actually got into it, is for our team and our kind of professional culture and within our staff, we have some very, how can I say, very linear thinkers. And so they wanted to know, you know, well, if this card says emerging, what percentage of people should be using this practice, or what's the right answer for this? And so we had to work through, again, after 1 or 2 rounds, people got the hang of it pretty quickly, but that idea of there is no right answer. We're not trying to like grade our team on a different category here. We're just trying to get some ideas and start to work together as a team to understand how are we working and where would we like to be. That was the other thing I think that the team really appreciated. As Lauren just mentioned, this tool is super flexible and really can be customized. So we started with those 2 subcomponents that I mentioned, and it really did generate this conversation that started to kind of connect to many other topics. And so we actually had to sort of cut the conversation off after a while. And afterwards in our debrief, we actually talked about, well, actually next time maybe we should start with these 3 topics because those seem to be kind of the emerging priorities. And so I suspect when we do, our plan is we do a annual work plan process, and then we have a kind of formal mid-year pause and reflect and check. And so we're planning to use the CLA Maturity Tool again with that, and probably do some different subcomponents than we did in the first round. So I think that was, maybe I'll stop there, but just to kind of highlight that this customizable, flexible tool was extremely useful for our team, really to be a great conversation starter. And the team, it's a way for people to talk about. Sometimes we did have some challenges in internal communication, but the way the tool is set up, those challenges are not don't come out in a way that's critical of anyone. It's about how is our team working, and we identify where there's some challenges, and the team is very in our case, was very comfortable to talk about those challenges without some of the finger pointing or criticism that can come in another type of setting. So we really enjoyed it. As you can see, the team is deep in thought, deep in conversation, and in typical Vietnam style, had a color-coded dress code to wear as a team that day. So we enjoyed it very much, and I'm happy to either now or later take any questions that people may have.
Yeah, please do think about your questions for Brian. We're going to circle back for the Q&A at the end. So if you think of something you want to ask him, feel free to put it in the chat now, but we'll also have some Q&A. Brian, thank you for sharing. I love this photo. It also helps that blue is my favorite color, so I love your color scheme. I just want to note a couple of things that Brian said, which I think are important in terms of the history of the development of the tool. So these small cards that he's mentioning and that Mona Lisa mentioned in terms of like the throw the cards down, this was an iteration that we made quite early on when we started going out and testing the tool and realizing that like when we started laying the spectrum out, you get very vocal people who would jump in right away and be like, well, clearly we're there, right? Either it was the leader who felt very strongly, or maybe it was just somebody who had a very strong opinion and they were like, nope, this is where we are. And how the conversation then really began to be about what that person's vote was. And so the small cards, a little bit to try to, again, get people engaged and gamify it a bit. They're the size of actual playing cards, physical playing cards. But so we actually tell people, okay, look at the spectrum as we lay it out, grab the card that you think most closely aligns with what your experience of our team is. And then we're going to count to 3 and everyone lays them down at the same time. And so these small cards were meant to sort of level the playing field and increase like an equal like participation so that everyone sort of had that moment to put their opinion down without being influenced by other people. And so we have, since we've been using those small cards, we really have experienced that that works very well. The other thing that Brian said that really, you know, speaks to the facilitator and me and Mona Lisa and Laura's heart is that this is really all about a conversation starter. It's not about what the actual decision is on where you guys land in terms of where you fall in the maturity scale, but it's about how like using the tool and using the cards and the description on the cards to spark that conversation so that people can share their perspectives on where they see the team, why they see the team there, why a particular description, you know, resonates with them more closely than others. And so, Mona Lisa, I just wanted to see if you wanted to say anything about that, because that's always been the ethos of the tool to me.
No, I think that's great, just how you talked about it. I'm also noticing the question from Esther. I don't know if you want to take that or if you want me to. Yeah. Oh, so Esther's asking, what would you recommend for an organization that has multiple projects in 20 countries? Some countries have 3 to 4 projects. So yes, I think I would first recommend that you think pretty intentionally about which country offices or projects are most ready to do something like this. You know, the whole ethos of this also is that it's that there are, to some extent, at least some champions who want to do this and who want to look at their practices and want to self-assess and want to take action. So I guess my first thing I would say is think about, you know, where do you have champions for doing this kind of process? And then focus there, because if there's a lot of energy, that'll make it easier in terms of seeing an actual impact from using the tool. The other thing I'll say is, if, you know, a lot of times, and this is something we also always said, is that everybody is doing CLA in one way or another. And so the other benefit of the tool that I don't think we've really mentioned, that we got a lot of feedback on, is that it just helps people understand CLA better. So I also think if you're thinking about project offices where actually they do a lot of CLA, but maybe they don't use that language or they don't really recognize that they're doing it, those could also be good offices to do it with, because it just helps bring awareness. Oh yeah, we're doing this. And it makes them even more champions for those kind of practices. So then once you've figured out sort of who's best to target, you know, I think you can potentially if you're, and I don't know where you're located, Esther, but if you're in some kind of headquarters, you could do like a session with champions in those offices to help share with them, how do you facilitate this? And then you could have them, do it in a self-guided way. It is really useful to have somebody with a facilitation background do it, at least to start. It's not essential, but it's always helpful if you have facilitators on your teams. And most teams do, because they're doing community work and they need to be facilitating those kind of conversations. So yeah, I guess those would be some of my top recommendations just to get started.
The one thing I might add to Mona Lisa's point, I'm going to click back to the previous slide where she talked about the process real fast. The very first step is intro and framing. And one of the conversations that you need to have in the framing part of the conversation is each of the cards says we do this. And so the part of the framing is who is the we that we're talking about. And so for example, we often encourage people to think about we at sort of the working level of who actually works together. Like, because if you're asking how do we collaborate, it actually has to be people who are collaborating, right? And so we're going to use the tool slightly differently today because we're a completely mixed group, right? We're not a team. And so you can do it as a mixed group, but you have to make that clear when we're talking about we, who is we? And the conversation happens slightly differently if it's not people who are actually working together on a team. And so back to your point, Esther, the self-assessment part of the conversation is easier if it is people on a team who work together. But if you're trying to sort of look across an organization at good practice that you want to, like cross-pollinate, you can have that conversation with this tool, as Mona Lisa says. You just have to be clear about then the we is much broader, right? So that's just something to know as well. So let's actually try it. Let's have a conversation about it. So what we're going to do now is we've picked a subcomponent to talk about, and I am going to lay out the cards virtually as if we were, had the physical ones. We're going to come back and use that annotate feature again. So rather than having your little stack of small cards and we count 1, 2, 3 and everyone lays them down, we're going to use that check mark again. So I'm going to turn annotation back on once I lay out the cards. But you'll see as I lay them out sort of how a facilitator would do that, just as Brian said, his team laid them out. And then we will use the annotate feature to put the check mark instead of laying down the cards. As I think Lauren said, you could also use candy or paper clips or whatever. And then we will go from there. So let me lay out the cards and then turn annotate back on. For those of you who just need a quick reminder, you access that annotate feature once I turn it on by going up to the view options next to your viewing my screen and then click on annotate. But we chose one of the new subcomponents we wanted to talk with you about. Mona Lisa mentioned to you that this was one of the ones that we changed more substantially from the original version of the tool to make it broader from just scenario planning, to be more about how are you paying attention to local context. And so the key concepts under this new card, this new subcomponent, are about identifying risks and opportunities in the local context, monitoring shifts in that context, and then also responding and applying learning from that monitoring. And so you can see how scenario planning would come in there, but that this is now much broader. So at the lowest level, at the not yet present, we are not yet aware of how the local context affects our programming. So really not on our radar yet. Moving one step up to emergent, we are informally identifying and monitoring changes in the context. So we're starting to do it, but it's a pretty informal process. At expanding, so about midway up the spectrum, we're sometimes doing it. So we're starting to identify the risks and opportunities. We're sometimes monitoring shifts in the local context, and we're sometimes responding to and applying the learning. The big jump from expanding to advanced, and it's almost always a pretty big jump between these two stages, but we're moving from sometimes to usually. So we're getting much more systematic about doing these things. We're usually identifying risks and opportunities in the local context. We're usually monitoring for those shifts if anything's happening. And then we're responding to and applying learning from the local context back into how it's affecting our programming. And then the final step up to institutionalized is we're doing those things consistently and systematically. And so this is also where you see that we're using tools and resources like scenario planning to help us identify those risks and opportunities and figure out when it might be appropriate, watching for those shifts and what we might do in that case if there is a shift. So you can see here, I'm going to go ahead and turn on annotate now, but I just want to explain a couple more things just so that you get a sense of how the cards work. I'm enabling annotation. So if you go to view options and click annotate, you can put your check mark where you feel like your particular organization falls. So again, because we're not a team, we're not doing it as we, but where you think your team, your own team falls. You see here that the way the cards are designed is that as you move up stages, there are things that are bold and underlined that are different and important from the stage previous. And so as a facilitator, that's a visual cue to what's different and important about the next stage up. The other thing is that you can see here that there is a logic that's consistent throughout the subcomponents and across the maturity spectrum that ends up being sort of not yet present is not yet, right? Like we're not doing it. And then emergent is like ad hoc, informal. Expanding is we're sometimes doing it, or the minority of people are starting to do it. Advanced is we're usually doing it, or the majority of people are doing it. And then institutionalized is really about consistency and systematization of that, like really bringing it into how you work as an organization. And so that flow is pretty standard throughout the entire, across all of the subcomponents. So I'm not seeing any check marks, so I'm wondering if I was not. Okay, I'm seeing check marks. Great. Go ahead and put your check marks where you think your organization falls in terms of contextual awareness. So this is if we were doing it in person, right? This is the point where I would have people like do the 1, 2, 3 and everyone lay down your cards. So we're seeing a lot of expanding and a lot of advanced. Okay, so sort of right in the middle of the spectrum. That's great. We often find, and this probably won't surprise many of you, but people like half steps, like, well, we're right in between, right? Like we're expanding plus or we're advanced minus. People love that. And we definitely let people do that, right? Like there's no reason not to, because it's not about the score. It's really about the conversation. All right, I see plenty of check marks. So the way that we usually go from here is, this is actually a pretty tight cluster. So if you have a tight cluster, it can happen. You can also have people all over the spectrum. So as a facilitator with a tight cluster like this, I would say, it seems like there may be just some nuance that separates people from expanding in advance. But I would just invite, does anyone want to share what stuck out to them in terms of the description that resonated with your own experience? So we'd love to hear some examples of why you felt like your team was at expanding or why you felt like your team was advanced. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to invite anyone who wants to come off mute and share a bit about like why they picked the stage that they picked. So if anyone wants to jump in, we're more than happy to see your video, hear your voice, whatever you're most comfortable with. Anybody want to chime in?
Sure, I can go. I'm sorry, I've got a fair amount of background noise right now. I'm Emily Janock, I'm from CARE. And one of the things about my role is that I work across lots of different projects. So it's more than one project and one team at a time. And so for me, what really jumped out was was that piece around the so I scored us as We sometimes do this, because when I got to the place where I was like, we usually respond to and apply learning, I was like, nope, I don't think I can say that. The other ones I think I could say usually, but that piece about like applying the learning, we know that that is the biggest challenge we're facing, to do that consistently.
Thanks, Emily. And yeah, actually we find that a lot, right? Because you'll remember that Mona Lisa said that every subcomponent has 3 key concepts. And we often find that people are like, actually, we're pretty good on the first 2, but the third one where the rubber meets the road is where we, right? Like where we struggle, right? And it's the one holding us back. And that's the perfect jumping off point for the conversation, right? You'd say, okay, if that's the piece of this that's holding us back from making the leap from expanding to advance, is there something there? Is there a leverage that we can, create there, a leverage point where we can put some action around that and brainstorm how to bump us up to the next level in that particular element. So that's very common that we see, and that's often why we find people who put half steps, right? Because they feel like actually we're at advanced on 2 of the of the key concepts, but there's just one holding us back. And so you often find that is part of the conversation that comes out as people start to explain their rationale. So very common. And thanks for jumping in, Emily. Anyone else? Oh, I see somebody's hand. Who do we have? Sorry, feel free to just jump in. I didn't see whose hand it was.
I think Thomas has.
Thomas, yeah.
Go for it, Thomas. Okay, we see you, but we don't hear you yet.
Let me try this.
There you go.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
All right, sorry. So the exercise is interesting, and thank you for the presentation. I chose expanding from an organization, and working in the spectrum, it becomes interesting to what extent you want to select which category you are in, especially between emergent and expanding. My difficulty was for emergent. I mean, our organization is a mail platform, and we have the CLA component where we work with, all the IPs and the mission. And though we provide support to individual IPs, we're gonna learn some things from them. We're gonna learn about local context, and we learn the way they implement their own CLA activities and all the learning from there. But right now it is somehow informally structured, but yet again, we are identifying opportunities, we're identifying risks. So there was a struggle between, to what extent on the spectrum, is it emergent or is it expanding? Because you will see that you are still gathering all the information, you are still identifying the risks, you are still identifying the opportunities, in as much as it's not so formally structured. But you are gathering, you are learning it from there, and you are figuring how to improve some of the processes and how to help the IPs or the mission formally structure this. And so I leaned towards expanding, but it was a kind of difficult to strike a balance between that, because the emergent kind of like was subsumed within the expanding. That's how it appeared to me. So just to share that experience. Thank you.
And as you talk it out, right? Like if you were doing this with your team, your explanation, as you say, like, this was my thought process of why I picked that, is like the key part of the conversation, right? So that then people would react and respond to what you said and build off of that. And so, yeah, the explanation of like, okay, this was how I got to where I ended up putting my check mark is the valuable part, not necessarily where your check mark landed. So thanks for that, Thomas. Appreciate it.
Well,
The other thing that it just makes me think of is, again, about picking subcomponents, right? So obviously local awareness is important for everyone, but it may be that a support contract, like an MEL support contract, would find this particular subcomponent less relevant to them than another one, right? And so this may be one that, like, in an MEL support contract setting, you wouldn't prioritize this one potentially. Because there may be other subcomponents that would be more relevant to the work that you're doing. potentially. So, Mona Lisa, Lauren, anything that you want to say about that?
I just wanted to make a quick general plug that, you know, originally, actually, when we came up with this, it was supposed to be about local organizations. And then we realized as we were doing it that it could apply local or international organizations. And the reason I just wanted to make that plug is, you know, these are the CLA skills are the things that we know from the evidence base are important for local organizations to have. So I also just want to encourage people to think about using this tool with their local partners, because I think it could contribute to discussions around their capacity areas they want to improve that are not the traditional like finance admin, but are actually really key skills for development effectiveness.
Thanks, Mona Lisa. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on the time, and what I want to do now is send us to breakout rooms. We're a much smaller group than I anticipated, so I invited lots of breakout room facilitators here to help when I thought we'd have 100 people. I think we're going to probably stick to about 4 breakout groups. So it's going to be me, Mona Lisa, Lauren, and Laura are going to be your breakout room facilitators. And we're going to do another one of these rounds with a different subcomponent in a slightly smaller group to hopefully promote a little bit more conversation. And we'll take, I'm guessing not a whole lot more than 10 minutes because of how small a group we are. So I'm going to ask Kobena if he is able to put us into rooms for about 10 minutes. Hopefully our facilitators have the slides so that you can do this layout. All right, Kobena, over to you.
Thank you, Jess. Should pretty soon, and programs should be starting shortly.
I know that was quick. I was trying to keep an eye on the time, and I wanted to make sure that we saved time for Q&A and to share resources, and also to hear from our. We have one more testimonial that I wanted to make sure that we haven't lost a chance to hear from. But hopefully, it gave you a flavor for what you can do with the cards in a virtual space. We do have slide decks of how of all of these cards animated, just like we're using them today. But also we have, when you go onto the Learning Lab website, there's also, you can print off physical copies of the deck as well. So whether you wanted to use it virtually or in person, we wanted to still give you a flavor for what that feels like. The next thing we do want to do is we want to invite FHI to share a bit about their own experience using the tool. My understanding is, although we were able to get Van in, she's not feeling well enough and her voice isn't strong enough. So Dan Levitt, the chief of party for EPIC, is going to share in her place. So Dan, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. So can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. I was giving a very long. So thank you for this. So I'm doing this cold. So for I beg all of your patience as I go through this, but I was involved in much of this. So I think I can do this in 5 minutes too. So I'm going to set a timer for myself. It's nice to see you all. So this is interesting. Maybe it's a little bit different than what Brian described, because we have several sub teams, and I think if we go to the next slide, I can explain why. So just very quickly, the EPIC project in Vietnam has 3 different sub projects in HIV, COVID, and CTIP, combating trafficking in persons, and we work in several provinces. And as a result, we have a fairly large team, about 30 people, and several sub teams. And the sub-teams include teams that focus on programmatic areas and also a strategic information team. And as a result, there is a lot of synergy, and oftentimes there are challenges working across these different sub-teams. But we realized when we were introduced to CLA that there was an opportunity for sub-teams to really do some internal exploration by choosing certain areas that they thought were of interest, and that we could take the learning from those internal explorations and then in larger group discussions and with team leads, figure out where we want to go as a team as well, as a whole team. So next slide, please. So this just gives you a sense of the timeline of how things panned out for us. We learned about the CLA Maturity Toolkit through different, actually different staff members who had attended Learn's Dojo program, which was an opportunity for people to learn in one of 3 different tracks you can see in the lower left. I actually attended a leadership track. Van Ang, who was going to present tonight, was in another track, and we were intrigued by the Maturity Toolkit in our different tracks as a way of bolstering communication and collaboration on our team. So what happened was in September, we had an offsite, and during that offsite, we introduced the tool to the team. And then as you can see, sub-teams were given the opportunity to decide on 2 to 3 areas that they wanted to focus on. And then they were also given the opportunity to choose who they wanted to facilitate the session. And what's great is that Van Ang, one of our team members, was the most chosen individual to facilitate those sessions. But we also had another team member who was a former team member who retired come in and facilitate as well. So there were different people facilitating those sessions, but nobody who was actually the lead of any one of those sub teams. So next slide, please. So this is just some photographs showing you when we introduced the toolkit. We tried to do it in a comfortable environment that was not our office environment, so that people were kind of thinking outside the box, so to speak, within the boxes. And this just shows you several sub-teams that were engaged in exploring the cards and then determining after the initial introduction, what are the ones that we want to focus on. And the reason that we asked them to choose the areas they wanted to focus on is because I thought as a leader, rather than being top down or prescriptive in this process, which I could have been, because there are certain areas I think some sub-teams probably should have focused on, that it would be probably, we'd get more bang for our buck if they chose the areas they wanted to focus on first. And then later, you know, as a leader, maybe I could inject some ideas about areas they'd want to focus on later, assuming that it was successful. So next slide, please. Yeah, great. So then what happened, you can see Van Ang actually pictured in the upper right and lower left, and actually lower right and upper left. She's in all of these. She then helped facilitate several of the sessions with the sub-teams, where they reviewed first what were the areas that they had chosen. They used the instructions in the facilitator's guide to be able to focus in on what those specific areas were. And then working together, they were able to identify, where do we stand along the continuum? Are we on the same page? Are we on different pages? What would it take for us to get some consensus around where we want to be down the line? And then next slide, please, I think. And then exactly, so once they were able to determine where do we want to stand, where do we want to be in terms of our own personal growth and status within the maturity spectrum, they were facilitated to conduct these action planning sessions, which is really fascinating, because I can say, from having been sent all of the summaries of the sessions from each of the teams and sitting down and looking through what they came up with, what was fascinating is there were some synergies that happened independently across sub-teams. So they were independently identifying some areas that they thought they needed to do some deeper focus on. And as an example, one of them was pause and reflect. Not only to conduct more internal pause and reflect exercises that could be systematized. Sorry, I meant 5 minutes, so I'll wrap up. But also conducting pause and reflect across partners, across sub-teams, as a way of getting together and making sure that data were effectively used to make program pivots that were strategic. Next slide. I think I'm basically done. Yeah, so this is just an example of a session agenda and an action plan. I don't need to go into detail because I just described those. Next slide. And then a set of lessons learned. And I think if I were just to highlight some of the most important lessons, it's really important that your facilitator has really done their homework in advance and fully understands the specific sub areas of focus. It's great to engage team leads in advance as well, so they kind of have an understanding of what their role could be in the process, if any. And then I think just looking at these, it's also really important, I think, because the planning sessions took place after the initial assessments, to do a clear review of what were the results, again, before you go into brainstorming, so that everybody's on the same page. And obviously engaging the team lead in the development of the action plan going forward is essential. Next slide. I think that's it. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And I'm sorry Venning wasn't able to present. She pulled those slides together beautifully for us and we wanted to hear from her, but she was a real superstar in this space. And so we're glad that we were able to spotlight the work that she did and Dan, that you were able to present that on her behalf. So thank you. Okay, so we've got about 8 minutes left for Q&A and resources. I'm not going to leave this Q&A slide up. Go ahead and put, come off mute or put your questions in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm going to just skip to the resources slide. We'll put these links in the chat. Obviously, when you get the slide deck afterwards, these are also, these links will be there. But the key that we would just want to point you to is all these things live on USAID Learning Lab. My guess is you're all probably pretty familiar with Learning Lab, but if not, usaidlearninglab.org. And if you put CLA Maturity Tool in the search bar, this is going to come up as like one of your first resources. As Mona Lisa said, there are a lot of facilitator resources. These were originally developed for the USAID version of the tool, but the process will be the same. And so those facilitator resources are still going to be immensely helpful to you if you want to facilitate. And then there's the USAID version of the tool on the website, but also we've created the IP version page as well, where you can get both the English and the Vietnamese of the spectrum cards, of the stage cards, of the the framework handout. All of that is available on the page called CLA Maturity Tool for Implementing Partners. Okay, so looking at questions now, Oliver, good to see you. Oliver and I worked together for years in Kenya. Great to see you. What is the ideal period to go back and assess progress on the maturity spectrum? Mona Lisa, I don't know, you want to take that one?
I think we heard Brian say, but a lot of times we'll hear teams come back to it annually. And I think, Brian, you were saying you were planning to do that also at the mid-year check-in. I think, again, we're very much in the choose your own adventure, choose what works for you kind of mentality. So, think about what makes sense for your situation. I know, in Vietnam, a lot of the partners are actually required to pause and reflect annually. So that would be a great time to do that. But again, make it make sense for you and your team, bottom line.
Oh, go ahead.
No, the other thing I was just going to add quickly is you don't have to make a big deal out of it either. So you can have a dedicated pause and reflect where you're really focusing on, doing 2 or 3 or 4 subcomponents. And action planning on those. But we've also seen on kind of internally, teams have good success just trying to integrate a self-assessment on one subcomponent into a standing meeting, into a team meeting.
I was literally going to say that, Lauren. That was going to be my point.
Mind meld, 8 years on. And so if you are integrating it into a standing meeting, then there are kind of other opportunities to come back and revisit how you're doing in a cadence that makes sense for your group.
I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat, so I want to just invite folks to come off mute or put your questions in the chat if you have anything else you're curious about. We have a lot of experience with folks in this group who've done this for many years now, so we're happy to share. All right. Then in that case, I might just give a big thank you to our colleagues from Vietnam who joined us late in their evening to do this with us, for Lauren for joining from the UK and sharing all of her vast experience with us, and to you all for being here. I know that it was hard to get on, and for those of you who struggled, we appreciate you persevering so that you were able to actually join the meeting. It's a real shame we weren't able to get more people in here with us, but we will be sharing the recording on the Evidence for Impact webpage of Social Impact's website. And so hopefully you might be able to help us spread the word once the recording is up, so that folks who weren't able to get in can watch it with us later. I also want to thank the people who I tapped to be small group facilitators who we didn't end up needing. I'm grateful that you were here with us to be on standby regardless. And any Any last questions? Any last thoughts? We still have 3 minutes, and we'd love to answer any questions or hear any reflections folks have.
Hi, this is Emily again, and I'm starting to feel a little self-conscious about always talking.
No, we're always happy to hear from you, Emily.
But one thing I've noticed, I've been using, not the implementing partner tool, but we've been using the full matrix for years and years, and it's such a great tool. I will say one of the things that we notice is that the biggest challenge with that is that it feels very complicated. There's so many pieces, and you look at that pie chart with all the little bits in there, and we see people get overwhelmed really fast. And so like for me, the biggest thing I can do or my team can do is help to simplify and help to make it really concrete and really like, we're going to do 2 things today, and these are things that it's possible for you to do. You don't need to be an expert. You don't need to have 10 years of background in this. And that's the place where we see the biggest leaps, is when we can make it feel approachable. And so just that, like, having the whole tool is really useful. And then part of our role is figuring out like how to zoom in so it's not so scary.
That's awesome. Thanks, Emily.
I see a question from Elizabeth that you might want to address, Jess, about who on the team generally initiates the use of the tool. Is it the project director, M&E staff, or who?
I would say it could be anyone, but having leadership buy into this process is important. And so you would definitely want your project leadership or your organization leadership to be supportive and to be promoting that you're going to take the time to do this process. But I would say that that doesn't necessarily mean that the leader has to like be the facilitator, right? Like we saw Vanang was the one chosen because of the skill and the expertise that she brought to facilitating those conversations for EPIC. But Dan, obviously a very strong proponent of this process and integrating it into a much larger change initiative that their team was undergoing. So I think the impetus can come from a lot of different places. I think that the leadership support, though, is absolutely critical. Lisa, Lauren, you want to jump in?
No, I think that's good. I think it can come from anywhere, as you were saying. There was another comment actually from underneath it. Any ideas on generating buy-in among teams for using the tools?
I would maybe say 2 things quickly. One is start small. So to Emily's point, I think it can be really useful, even as the facilitator, or as like if the facilitator and whoever's instigating it, to kind of narrow down the options before you get started, so it's not to overwhelm people. And I think when people aren't overwhelmed, they're more likely to get bought in. The second thing is starting another way to start is to use the tool to discuss an identified pain point. So if there's something that you're already struggling with, if adaptive management is in like really moving into that implementing adaptively space is really hard, then using a part of the tool that already kind of speaks to a known need can be a good way to get going, and might open up possibilities for then exploring other subcomponents as well.
And we've also seen people take that idea, as Lauren said, and like if you're going to start small and pick like 2, maybe pick one area where you feel strong in, so that you can actually have sort of more of an appreciative inquiry conversation, and one area where you do have pain points, right? So it's not just like, let's focus on where we're weak, but maybe pick one where you're strong and really have that appreciative conversation, and then where you do have those pain points and where you can see where you can identify to grow. So those are different ways too. All right. We can hang out for another minute or 2. But again, I'll just say a big thank you to everyone who was able to get into the Zoom, to join us, and to be here with us this morning, this afternoon, this evening. For those of you who are headed to bed, have a great night. Thank you so much for spending your evening with us. The rest of you have a terrific day, and we can hang out for another minute and see if there's any more questions. But really appreciate you being here with us, and take care, everyone. Happy holidays. Lots of people have to jump off for meetings, so not a problem. Feel better, Vaneng. I'm sorry about your voice. Glad you were able to finally make it in and join us, even if you couldn't talk.
I exist. I exist.
You sound awful. Don't talk. Don't talk. Save your voice. All right. I think we may end there then, since I don't see any other questions, but thank you everyone. Again, have a terrific day or a great evening, and we'll get the recording posted and out to everyone who is able to register. We do hope you help us spread the word, since we had so many tech challenges. So take care, and again, best of luck with everything. Please do continue to use the tool and explore it. We think that there's a lot of possibility out there. So thanks for everything.